Great. And it looks like Secretary Buttigieg is with us and ready to go. Thank you so much for being here today.
Hi, good afternoon. How are you?
I'm great. I'm excited. How are you doing?
Good. I'll be with you. Thanks for bearing
Great.
with me for the just-in-time delivery here. A couple minutes late. I apologize.
No worries. I mean, I'm sure we all understand that you're a busy person, lots of investments going on in the Department of Transportation currently.
So that.
Great. I think just to get us started, the Department of Transportation, which you oversee, is one of the agencies that is covered by the Justice 40 Initiative. So for those who aren't familiar, the Justice 40 Initiative states that 40% of the overall benefits of certain federal investments flow to disadvantaged communities. Can you provide some details on what benefit means in this context and how the Department of Transportation ensures that what you define as a benefit is also considered a benefit to disadvantaged communities?
Yeah. First of all, thanks for having me, and really appreciate the chance to be engaging you. And when I just think about the importance of the public servants and future public servants who are being trained in this program, I really appreciate the chance to engage you, because we're going to be calling on this generation of thought leaders and practitioners. We're hiring as we speak here at the department, and there's never been a better time to be involved in this work. So to come very directly to your question, we know that the benefits of transportation infrastructure have not been shared evenly or equally in the past in this country. And that goes to everything from the simple availability or non-availability of good transit or good roads or other good transportation assets in overburdened and underserved communities, to things that are a little bit second order but very important, like access to clean air, which is impacted by siting decisions and technology decisions about ports, airports, highways, roads, and transit. And importantly, the work associated with actually delivering big infrastructure projects. So in a moment like this, where we're making the biggest investment in public transit in history, biggest investment in rail since the creation of Amtrak, some of which, by the way, is quite close to home for you all. We just broke ground on the Portal North Bridge, which was originally built during the Roosevelt administration, the Teddy Roosevelt administration, and is now being replaced and will benefit over, I think, about 200 trains a day, so hundreds of thousands of passengers on a daily basis who count on it. Just to give you one example. The actual jobs associated with delivering the project is another example of a benefit to transportation infrastructure that has not been distributed evenly in past decisions. We have a chance to change that, and our focus on local hire, on apprenticeships, the President's Justice 40 Initiative, which sets out explicit targets for how to make sure that the benefits of clean energy investments and clean infrastructure investments go to those who have been left out. Those all allow us to be very intentional, compel us to be very intentional about how to make this not only the most ambitious infrastructure investment in modern times, but also the most equitable.
Great. Thank you so much for your answer. And I really appreciate how you're weaving in not just transportation, but also clean air. That kind of has to do with one of your ideas that you've been promoting recently. And the title of this event, Transportation Policy is Climate Policy. I think one area where the connection between these two fields is really interesting is within electric vehicles, right? On one hand, we have technology that's allowing for zero or little to no emissions at the tailpipe. But on the other hand, we also have this technology that is currently dependent on lithium mining and carries additional environmental implication when it comes to the generation and transportation of energy. So given this context, given this duality, how can we ensure that we're truly capturing clean power as we move toward the electrification of vehicles?
Well, I think in all policymaking, you have to confront the fact that we are dealing not with the ability to eliminate impacts, but choosing which impacts are most important to address. That's true when we're talking about the effect that road building has on a community. The only way to have no road building impact is to have no roads. Or whether we're talking about the energy use involved and the materials used involved in electric vehicles. What we know, though, is that climate pollution and gas pollution from gas-powered vehicles is one of the main elements that is contributing to transportation's share of climate change. And we know that even if you assume, for the sake of argument, that all of the electricity going into an EV is made from fossil fuels generated in fossil fueled generation plants, it's still more energy efficient to turn those fossil fuels into electricity at utility scale, transmit that electricity to a car, charge that car, than it is to individually load a few gallons of that fossil fuel into millions of cars and set it on fire in one engine at a time, which is what we do right now. So the point is, you start with that baseline, and then the great thing about our energy mix is it will get cleaner over time. It's true that it's only as clean as the energy that goes into it, but it's also true that we are moving in a direction of less carbon intensive and less pollution intensive electricity generation, I would say each passing year, and we'll continue to do that. Now, there's also the manufacturing of EVs, and that's something where there are a lot of very interesting conversations happening right now with the car manufacturing companies about how to be, for example, less dependent on things like cobalt, which from a human rights perspective as well as an environmental impact perspective are very problematic. And you know, the truth is the chemistry of batteries is not completely kind of stabilized. I don't mean in a chemical sense, but in a market sense. This is something that's still evolving in terms of how the technology is used. But what we really need to do is recognize that nothing will be free of impact. But we need to prioritize the things that are going to have the least impact or have impacts in different ways. It's the same as I think the reckoning that's happening within the environmental movement about nuclear power generation, which is not about waving away the environmental concerns that come with nuclear power generation. It is about recognizing that if the number one problem right now is carbon, then a form of energy generation which is carbon-free, though not pollution-free, is one that deserves more attention than one that is carbon-intensive. And these are the kinds of trade-offs and choices that we're making right now. Nothing's a panacea, but some of what we're doing could have radical positive implications for our environment on a short time scale. And that's the other thing that's exciting about EVs. We're working hard on hard to decarbonize sectors of transportation, like aviation and shipping. It's going to take a while to be able to have, for example, alternative forms of propulsion for aviation, or even a sustainable aviation fuel, which there is such a thing, but it's not being produced at scale. On the other hand, the technology for EVs is here right now. People are buying these things at car dealers as we speak. So the challenge there is to make it more affordable, more accessible, easier to charge. And then, of course, over time, to make sure that the energy sources and the production of the vehicles themselves becomes always cleaner than it used to be.
Thank you, Secretary Buttigieg. I saw a lot of applauses in the chat. I think that's a really interesting way to think about impact and what it means to mitigate and what it means to eliminate. I think I'd be interested in hearing you talk a little more of when we're talking about lessening our impact through new technology. How can we make sure that future transportation policy and future technology within the transportation sector kind of meaningfully reduces emissions and impacts specifically within the communities that have historically been subject to the most impact, the most pollution?
So a couple of things I think are really important to bear in mind. First of all, the voice of the communities themselves. So making sure that we have planning processes and policy processes that include the voices of people who have been excluded in the past is critically important to getting this right. And we've sought to do that in the creation of the infrastructure law, and certainly are working to do that in its implementation with a high degree of public engagement and a lot of involvement by our Departmental Office of Civil Rights to ensure that these questions of community engagement are answered on the front end rather than at the 11th hour, which, by the way, also has projects done on time, to take that community input on board and be willing to examine things that need to be done differently early rather than late. The other thing is that we have it really built into the design of the infrastructure package and the legislation to make investments in places that will benefit from this kind of attention to equity and to inclusion in terms of where people will notice the difference, not just in terms of being able to use a different and better transportation resource. That's huge. Just having a better, more reliable bus service, or a more frequent subway service, or a better road or bridge in your neighborhood. But also recognizing that the technologies and the equipment and the infrastructure that are used impacts people who aren't directly involved in the transportation enterprise itself. And a good example of this is ports. Typically, the communities of people who live nearest to ports are Black and Latino residents. It is also typically the case that there are measurable public health impacts like higher rates of asthma in and around ports where you have ships burning fuel that has a high level of pollution associated with it, and a lot of trucks coming and going. So if you can electrify trucks, or improve the pollution coming from the ships, or use technology called cold ironing, which to simplify a little bit basically means plugging a ship in when it's at dock at berth, instead of having it run its engines in order to power its onboard equipment. Those things have a benefit for people who live in the community who are impacted by shipping, even if they don't have anything to do with shipping professionally. And those are the things that we need to look at that are built into the priorities that we're using to decide how grants are being used. And in many cases, built into the legislation itself.
Yeah, thank you so much for that answer, Secretary Buttigieg, and definitely appreciate your attention that you and your department are giving to historically marginalized and overburdened communities. I think on that note, during your time as Secretary of Transportation, the Department of Transportation has actually established its own definition of disadvantaged communities to use within your policies and programs. Can you talk a little bit about why it was important for your department to create its own definition and what impact that definition has had on recent infrastructure investments you have undertaken?
Yeah, so the basic thinking here is that you have to be able to measure these things and find them in order to act on them. And I know that might sound like kind of managerial or technocratic speak, but it's also clear that for there to be any accountability around the use of these funds, we have to make decisions up front about how to define a disadvantaged community, how to define community benefit, even how to define what clean transportation infrastructure really looks like. And so making sure that we went through the exercise as a department and on an interagency basis where we're working with partners across the administration. Because remember, this is part of our slice of this infrastructure package, about half of the overall 1.2 trillion. You have electric school buses being overseen by the EPA along with the water investments. You have broadband investment being overseen by the Department of Commerce. You have the Army Corps of Engineers. There are a lot of different players here, although we're the single biggest piece representing about half of it. And so we've got to make sure that we have a transparent, inclusively defined basis for saying these are examples of communities that have experienced these kinds of disadvantages in the past, often even directly because of transportation decisions that were made. In other words, not just in a vacuum are these communities disadvantaged, but you look at how, I was just in Detroit, I-375, which we're providing $100 million to help the community take this road, which basically cuts like a kind of a gash, dividing a neighborhood from downtown, and during its construction destroyed 2 Black neighborhoods. And we're going to elevate it to a boulevard type of streetscape, which will benefit everybody. But every community has an example of something like this. an interchange highway, a railway that has created a boundary or in its construction removed communities, almost always communities of color that were disadvantaged. So we need to take account of this. And I mean this in a very real sense. We need to literally account for the impacts and account for what we're doing about it. And what's so exciting about this infrastructure law is it gives us the resources, not just to offer moral support for disadvantaged communities, but actual funding to help make things better.
Again, thank you so much for that answer, Secretary Buttigieg. It looks like I only have a few more minutes left with you, so I'll kind of transition into kind of a bigger question. Thank you for bearing through all of my policy questions. But I'd be really interested in hearing from you on how you think my peers in the class of 2023 will be commuting in the next 30 years.
Great question. One of my colleagues has pointed out that we tend to overestimate what technological change will mean in the short term and underestimate what it'll be in the medium to long term. And so I like the framing of your question because I think that's the scope where the biggest changes will happen. Consider something like automated cars, which has been described as being 7 years away for about 10 years. And clearly is taking longer to drive the kind of radical transformations we envisioned than people would have expected 10 or 12 years ago. And yet we know that certainly by the time we get to the middle of the century, there will be some profound differences to what it means to get around in a vehicle compared to what it's like today. We can't always predict these changes. After all, the most important transportation technology of the last decade turned out to be the smartphone. It's not even obviously a piece of transportation technology, but between ride sharing, GPS mapping, and the impact it's had even on active transportation like bike and scooter sharing, it's probably done more than any other invention to change transportation in a short period. So we have to have some humility about exactly what's going to happen. Somebody told me that just a few weeks ago was the date that is notionally the birthday of George Jetson. And when we get into Jetson style transportation, I don't know. But we are seeing what's called advanced air mobility. In other words, these vertical takeoff and landing and sometimes automated flight things. And again, by the middle of the century, maybe not part of a daily commute Jetson style, but certainly part of what a network serving an airport looks like. I imagine that by the middle of the century, we'll have more excellent and routine use of transit, not only by people who are considered to be transit dependent, but just as a means of choice for getting around, which is not true in most American communities, although New York might be an exception. The place where, as one thinker once put it, you have an indication of civilization that isn't how many poor people have cars, but how many rich people use the subway. I think we will have a more equitable level of access to transportation, but also, if we get this right, by the middle of the century, economists will agree that part of how we closed racial wealth gaps in this country will have been the wealth created through the construction of transportation infrastructure in the 2020s. And that's an exciting thing to think about too. Everything from land use to carbon pollution will be very, very different in the middle of the century, thanks to the investments we're making right now. But that's why there's so much pressure to get it right. And you and your classmates are going to play a huge role in delivering that. We're just at the outset of this infrastructure decade. And a huge part of whether things unfold as successfully as they might is the talent that we need to bring to bear on actually getting this stuff done, which is why I'll circle back a little bit to where I began, which is we're hiring. The transportation sector more generally is looking for brilliant, diverse, capable, public-spirited people. And we're going to need it in every aspect of transportation, from cybersecurity to aviation to city design. And hopefully I will find many of those participating in this call to be colleagues in the future.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Secretary Judge. Thank you so much for the plug. I hope I'm not talking over anybody right now, but really appreciate your answers and the time you're able to spend to speak to our audience today.